Hi, my name is Samuel Williams, and I'm a project manager for Sustainable Conservation's Solutions in Our Soils program. And today I'm going to be sharing about the policy implementation findings from the collaborative Cover Cropping in the SGMA Era report. So thank you for your interest in groundwater policy implementation and its interactions with cover cropping. This presentation further explains and contextualizes the policy findings of 2024's Cover Cropping in the SGMA Era report. And it includes a review of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and its implementation. This presentation is geared towards researchers, technical assistance providers, and beyond, and we hope it will prove valuable to all those in related sectors. If this is your first time hearing of this report, please check the link in the description for a presentation that covers its background and content in more depth, as well as a link to the PDF of the full report and the executive summary. So for today's presentation, we're going to start out by grounding in the report itself and its development process and review some of the key science outcomes that have emerged from the collaborative effort. We're going to take those into the policy discussion. So to dig into this policy implementation, we will start by reviewing the most basic elements of SGMA policy and the steps that must be taken for the local agencies to implement it. We'll break down this implementation and highlight the aspects that are most related to cover cropping. And we'll do this by framing our report policy findings within the lens of these steps and following up with two deeper dives into some pretty consequential findings that require a bit more context. Finally, we'll highlight the most important takeaways for driving this work forward. So let's start with the background. In 2022, as more local groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs, were developing and implementing their plans, we began to hear a lot of concerns about the ways cover cropping would be treated under SGMA. There were concerns about GSAs penalizing growers, growers discontinuing their plantings, and also growers just wondering how much water they would have to budget for the practice. And so really there were several big questions that were emerging. And these were one around the science. So what are the water benefits and the water use of cover crops? The next were around the policy. So how does the implementation of SGMA interact with this practice? And finally, we had questions around how to better integrate the science and policy and move forward to ensure that this practice can be used where and when it makes sense under SGMA. So to respond to these concerns and start answering those big questions, the groups you see here supported a three-part convening series where more than 100 experts at the soil-water interface gathered together to discuss exactly these questions. And there was a lot of great learning and information shared. And at the end of this series, folks recognized that we needed to capture that information and continue to follow up on the most important questions. So to do that, we began a collaborative report writing process leading to the development of this report, Cover Cropping in the SGMA Era. Now, I'd like to highlight the diverse group of collaborative authors um, that contributed to this work, and that this really was building on the discussion and input of all the convening participants. So a huge thank you to all the report authors and the 100 plus contributors to that convening series. This work wouldn't have been possible without them. So this report contained different sections which address those three big questions around the science, the policy, and the next steps. But today's focus will really be on the policy analysis. And in order to do that, we need to ground in the relevant science findings that inform this analysis. So we'll start here by looking at the water use side of the equation for cover crops. So in an extensive literature review of California relevant works, the collaborative group identified that in terms of cover crop water use, that water use is variable. It depends on context, management, and beyond. Cover cropping itself consists of a huge variety of practices. And when we're talking about cover cropping in water scarce environments, we're generally speaking about cool season, predominantly rain-fed cover crops. And for this type of cover cropping, we found that there are circumstances where the difference between the evapotranspiration or water use of cover cropped ground and bare ground can be negligible in both perennial and annual systems. And this is really important because it's often assumed that cover crops will dramatically increase water use compared to their alternative, but this isn't necessarily the case. So, in terms of those cover crop water benefits of the practice, that through that same literature review, changes to runoff and infiltration are the most consistently observed water benefits to cover cropping. Now, some quick definitions. Infiltration is the movement of water from the soil surface into the soil, and runoff refers to water that doesn't infiltrate and instead moves laterally across the soil surface. So, in quantifying these benefits, the authors were able to agree to a conservative estimate, often of 40% or more increase in infiltration and often 40% or more decrease in runoff. And this was regardless of slope or other environmental factors that could result in much greater benefits. So, while more research can help us better understand the conditions to maximize these benefits, we have a great starting point and clear, easy to use numbers, these 40%, that we can use now. So, let's get into the heart of today's presentation, the analysis of Sigma implementation and how this interacts with cover cropping. So, first, I want to share a little bit about the methodology. We started by reviewing Sigma regulations and requirements to better understand what it was asking of these local GSAs and what it required. Then we analyzed the policies of 9 different GSAs in the San Joaquin Valley. Now, the San Joaquin Valley was chosen as it has the highest concentration of critically overdrafted basins, and thus we could examine plans in further stages of development. So, after digging into the documentation of these plans as much as possible, we followed up with interviews with GSA staff and their consultants. And all of the information I'm presenting today is also found in the report. And before we get into it, I want to share a few considerations that we hope you'll keep in mind as we go over these findings. So, the first is that these findings are from a subset of 9 GSAs, and they potentially represent some trends and help us understand what approaches other GSAs may take, but they are not necessarily universal and shouldn't be taken as such. Additionally, there may have been updates and changes since we investigated these plans in 2022 or 2023. This is a rapidly moving process, and it's possible that even where we looked, these processes have been updated. And the next consideration is really just that achieving Sigma mandates is complex. Just doing our analysis was incredibly complicated and gave us a taste of just how much the GSAs are grappling with. GSAs are stretched for resources, looking for guidance. The findings, therefore, don't reflect a lack of interest in these processes, but rather a lack of information, guidance, resources to more effectively address them. So, getting into an overview of Sigma. Now, lowering groundwater levels were leading to a host of negative consequences across a large swaths of the state. And these lowering groundwater levels also were leading to damage to infrastructure, degrading water quality, and other negative impacts. So, in 2014, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed to address these, with the goal of achieving a balance in aquifer inflows and outflows for California basins, and preventing these negative impacts that were coming out of the lowering groundwater levels. And this was to be done by 2040 or 2042. Now, the legislation was designed with local control in mind. The act created localized agencies called Groundwater Sustainability Agencies, or GSAs, to develop and implement plans to avoid the negative impacts of overdraft. Now, Sigma requires GSAs to lead planning and implementation to avoid the negative impacts of overdraft, but it also included the Department of Water Resources, DWR, and the State Water Resources Control Board, or the State Board, to offer assistance, support, to evaluate the plans, and potentially to step in for enforcement. And all of this work was to be informed by broad stakeholder input. So Sigma split the responsibilities between the GSAs, DWR, and State Water Board, with a heavy weighting towards GSAs in terms of that planning and implementation. Now, the carrot here was really the local decision-making power for the GSAs, and the stick was state intervention if the plans of the GSAs were found to be insufficient. So, GSAs are required to stop overdraft by bringing basins into balance and avoiding these 6 undesirable results that can often co-occur with groundwater overdraft. But how exactly does the GSA understand the volumes of water moving into and out of their basin, or the amount of overdraft, or the changes that are needed to reach that balance? And now we'll get into this generalized GSA process with the first step, which is the development of a water budget. So a water budget is a model of all the water that moves into, within, and out of a basin. And here's a simplified visual to give you the general idea. So after a GSA identifies all of the flows of the water within the basin, they quantify these flows. And they do this on an annual basis. So annually, how much groundwater is pumped, how much precipitation falls, and how much surface water flows into and out of the basin. And there are so many more flows. But for now, we'll leave it here. So once that GSA has a water budget, they can calculate the sustainable yield. Now, calculating the sustainable yield is the next step to getting to balance. Overdrafted basins currently look something like this, where the aquifer outflows outweigh the inflows, leading to declining aquifers over time. But a GSA's job is to balance those flows while avoiding these 6 undesirable results. And they can go about this in a few ways. They can look to increase the inflows or decrease the outflows. Now, for increasing inflows, groundwater recharge is a great example. And for decreasing those outflows, this is done by decreasing groundwater extraction. And this process is also referred to as demand management. In the image here, I'm using managed simply to refer to those flows over which humans have control and can influence based on our actions. And in order to go about demand management, GSAs need to know the exact amount of water that can be extracted from aquifers while maintaining this balance. And that amount of water is the sustainable yield. So now we have our sustainable yield. But what do we do with this? In the most overdrafted basins where increasing inflows is not enough, GSAs are implementing demand management to reduce outflows. And demand management is most commonly in the form of groundwater allocations. But what is an allocation? An allocation is the subdivision of the sustainable yield and its subsequent allotment to individual water users. So the amount of groundwater an individual water user may consume or remove from the system in a given year. And in order for allocations to be meaningful, groundwater use must be calculated and compared to the allocation. So how much water has the user consumed? And was it more than they were allocated? And that's the final stage in this process. And this is also the stage where much of the concern for cover cropping is concentrated in these groundwater allocations and how they will impact growers' ability to use cover crops. So here's our full process. The GSAs develop a water budget to calculate the flows, and this water budget is used to calculate the sustainable yield, all the groundwater that we can take each year while maintaining that balance. And in the most overdrafted basins, that sustainable yield is then allocated out to water users. And finally, water use has to be calculated and compared to those allocations. So let's talk about the factors that are most relevant for cover cropping that play into this process. So precipitation is a vital one because when we're talking about cover cropping in water scarce environments, and especially those that minimize water use, we're often talking about cool season rain-fed cover crops. So the predominant source of water for them is precipitation. Additionally, infiltration and runoff are important factors because they help determine how water flows in and out of the system. And they're also where cover crops have clear benefits, those 40% that I mentioned before. And finally, water use, cover crop water use is a really relevant factor. If we've got allocations, the amount of that allocation that a cover crop will use is pretty important to understand. So I've placed these factor icons into the GSA processes where they are most directly incorporated. And we can see that they're actually pretty central within the water budget, the development of allocations, and the calculation of water use to compare against those allocations. All right, so now that we've shared this basic process, let's get into our high-level findings. Now, a quick note here, the numbers in blue boxes, so here number 1, they correlate with the order of the findings in the report. They're not meant as an order of importance or anything like that. hopefully they're just helpful if you want to go back to the report and read more about any of these findings. So our first finding here touches on the complexity of this work and some consequences of that complexity in the context of the GSAs. Now, what I've shared thus far is a really simple version of these processes. So let's take a look at the water budget to demonstrate this. So here is a kind of more in-depth water budget that more accurately represents what GSAs are trying to understand. And if we take a look at this, you can just see how much more is going on here. So imagine the complexity of accounting for all of these flows, calculating their average yearly magnitude, accounting for the annual groundwater use, et cetera, et cetera. So this helps demonstrate our report finding around the complexity of GSA workloads and their context. There's truly an incredible amount of work that goes into these in such a short time, and generally speaking, with pretty limited resources. And the second part of this finding is due to the framing of sigma around local control. Now, there was no roadmap for GSAs to follow, so they had the freedom to achieve the goals by their own means, but they didn't have great examples of how exactly to do so. And this has led to different approaches with differing levels of rigor. This variation between GSAs was then furthered by local dynamics, capacity, and resource availability. Our next finding is that there are several common assumptions that have been integrated into GSA approaches that do not necessarily reflect the best available science and potentially preclude the ability to account for the benefits of certain land management decisions, such as cover cropping. Now, these assumptions are not universal, but they are common and are often found in water budgets and filter through to subsequent processes. So let's take a quick look at these assumptions. The first is that runoff is negligible. Now, we know that cover cropping can reduce runoff by 40% or more. However, if GSAs are assuming that this process of runoff is not occurring, then this benefit cannot be accounted for. The second assumption is that the percentage of precipitation that percolates is fixed. In other words, that the proportion of rain or other precipitation that enters the soil below the root zone and eventually returns to the aquifer is constant. Some GSAs do use soil type to differentiate percolation, but we know that factors like soil condition, cover crops, surface crusting, and more can all influence the proportion of water entering the soil and percolating below the root zone. And the third assumption is that that evaporation from bare ground is negligible. Now, we know that bare ground can evaporate substantial amounts of water, especially after precipitation events. So by incorporating these assumptions, there is less space for cover crops to be incorporated in ways that accurately capture their benefits. And sometimes these assumptions are wrapped up into process development in unhelpful ways. So the assumption that bare ground does not lose water to evaporation can lead to requirements for bare ground in certain incentive programs. We only found a requirement for bare ground in one such GSA incentive program, but this requirement has the potential to lead to other negative impacts without even achieving its estimated water savings if it's based on this assumption. We're really hoping to avoid this outcome in future planning. So our next finding is that we had heard about farmers being fined or otherwise directly penalized for having cover crops, but we haven't encountered any evidence of this. That being said, cover crop water use is accounted for, but as we've discussed, the key benefits might not be. So we do have a potential disincentive here. Our next finding is around a concept we refer to as the illusion of precision. So complex information and decisions are going into determining the overarching estimates of the water budget flows and therefore the sustainable yield. And when it comes to the allocations, the sustainable yield is then subdivided into many smaller pieces, sometimes to very specific or small amounts. This is a natural consequence of the system, and it means that the margins of errors could be relatively large compared to the individual allocations and the water use being calculated within them. So if this relationship was acknowledged, perhaps GSAs could manage around it in ways that support multi-benefit practices. but generally speaking, it isn't. So there isn't much slack in the system to support practices like cover cropping from the GSA level. On to our next finding, that current GSA approaches could impact the implementation of not only cover crops, but also other non-cash crop vegetation, and therefore the success of other policies, programs, and efforts aimed at getting these on the landscape in California. So with that, let's take a deeper dive into some of the findings that require a bit more context. When we get to the last stage of the GSA process, where they're calculating the water use of individual water users, um, this is where that calculation of water use in a given year is important. Now, most of the discussion and controversy in this stage has been about the accuracy of satellite ET estimates versus the accuracy of flow meters. And while that's an important discussion, there's also another missing piece, and that is a specific focus on how satellite-based ET estimates might create greater margins of error for cover crops as compared to the most common crops. And this is something that we need to generate more information about. At the same time, there is another critical element here that hasn't been discussed much at all. And this is where our finding about converting tool data into consumptive use of groundwater comes into play. Now, both of these are important, but we want to spend some time today to dig into the one that we feel is often overlooked and underappreciated in terms of its significance for cover crops. So, GSAs are responsible for the sustainable management of groundwater. And for assessing water use against allocations, it's the amount of groundwater that is used or consumed and leaves the system. So the most common term for this groundwater that's used is the consumptive use of groundwater, often written shorthand as the CUgw. But how do GSAs calculate the consumptive use of groundwater of individual water users? So they have two main tools to do this, and these are satellite-based ET estimates and flow meters. Now, most GSAs are using satellite-based ET estimates, with some using flow meters as a backup option. Now, two important points here. These two types of tools measure or calculate different things, and neither of those things is the consumptive use of groundwater, that term that the GSAs are actually looking for. So satellite ET estimates the total consumptive use, or the total evapotranspiration, while flow meters measure applied water. Neither of these is the consumptive use of groundwater. So the consumptive use of groundwater needs to be calculated using the tool data as well as other factors. And it is these other factors that include some assumptions that can be really important for cover cropping. So let's break this down a little bit more. And apologies in advance for putting some equations on the screen, but here we go. So satellite-based ET estimates measure the total evapotranspiration. Now that total ET includes water consumed from all sources, so groundwater, surface water, and precipitation. Now, in this example, the GSA wants to kind of isolate that consumptive use of groundwater. So we subtract the consumptive use of surface water and consumptive use of precipitation. Now, actually figuring out both of these amounts rests on certain assumptions and simplifications for these complex processes. Now, let's move into flow meters. So flow meters measure applied water. Let's say, to keep it simple, we only apply groundwater, and thus the flow meter captures all groundwater pumped and applied. However, when we apply that groundwater, a portion will leave the basin through ET, a portion might run off, and a portion will percolate back into the ground. And when calculating these pieces, these other factors, we run into exactly the same issue. We have data coming from the tool having to be combined with these other more complex processes. And there are assumptions baked into how we're estimating those processes. So let's look at this with an eye to cover cropping. So these factors where the simplified assumptions are used are exactly the factors that are directly tied with cover cropping and its benefits. So for satellite-based ET estimates, the consumptive use of precipitation is a really important factor. Also known as effective precipitation, this is the amount of precip that is consumed or leaves the basin through ET. Now, to determine how much of the precip is consumed, we need to determine how much of that precip is not consumed. That is, how much of it infiltrates and percolates or runs off. In other words, decisions about precipitation, infiltration, and runoff are all important aspects for determining the consumptive use of groundwater when using satellite ET estimates. And this is true for flow meters as well. Flow meters measure the amount of total applied water, but what percentage of that applied water ends up being lost to runoff or stays in the basin due to percolation? The cover crop connection to runoff is clear, but what about percolation? Well, we know that infiltration is one of the factors that influences percolation. So precipitation, runoff, and infiltration are key. And these are the areas where cover crops have most consistently demonstrated these water cycle benefits in California. So as we better quantify and articulate these benefits, the assumptions made in these calculations could be adjusted to more accurately reflect cover crops and their benefits. So going back to our finding, this is why the conversion of tool data is so important for cover crops, because decisions about precip, infiltration, and runoff are embedded in these calculations, and they are the clear levers to better account for the benefits of cover cropping. All right, so in the last section, we discussed the importance of precipitation and effectively incorporating where that water goes when calculating the consumptive use of groundwater. Now, effectively incorporating precipitation is critical not just in this stage, but across the many stages of groundwater planning that GSAs must complete. And that being said, it is very difficult to do. And some of the approaches GSAs have taken may result in unintended outcomes. So let's talk about that. For starters, why is precipitation such a challenge? Well, it's a vital flow in every basin, even in those very arid basins. And this difficulty is also connected to the variability of precipitation. So the first kind of piece of that variability is around the annual variability. So year on year, the amounts and timing of precipitation, whether we have wet years or dry years, which is highly variable in California. The next kind of area of variability is around the spatial distribution of that precipitation. So how much is falling at each location on the landscape? And this can vary fairly substantially, even within small geographic areas. Another facet that complicates this is the intensity of any given precipitation event. And this only becomes more important with climate change. And finally, we have questions about the destination of the water that falls as precipitation. So how much of it ends up running off, percolating back to the aquifer, or leaving the basin through ET. And the difficulties with precipitation become more clear as we look into how it is being included in allocation processes more generally. So here are important decision points where GSAs could take different paths to integrate precipitation into these allocations. And the different choices they make lead to considerable variation among these GSAs. Now, this framework that I'm about to share is something that we developed to highlight the differences between their approaches. It is not necessarily representative of the way GSAs framed or think about these decisions. But let's get into it. The first decision point is what base precipitation will be used, an average annual amount or the actual amount that falls that year. And if you're using an average, from what years are you defining that average? Our next decision point is around the fraction that a GSA will add into the allocation. So if a GSA uses an average annual precipitation in their allocation, they then have to account for the precipitation that will not be consumptively used, that will return to groundwater. So they make a decision about what that fixed percentage should be and allocate the rest out to growers. In the next stage, GSAs decide how the precipitation is incorporated in the allocation. Now, it can be included with the total or as its own bucket, or even not at all, which leads us to the next step. How is the allocation drawn down. So the precipitation could be drawn down from the total allocation or from the precipitation bucket first if the GSA went that route. And if the GSA is using actual precipitation, they instead remove the CU precip from the satellite-based estimate of the total consumptive use. And the remainder, the consumptive use of groundwater, is the only piece that's counted against the grower's account. And the final decision point is what adjustments, if any, are made to account for the differences between actual precipitation and average precipitation. In those cases, average was used. Now, I'm not going to review these, but as you can see, there are many options here. And I hope it's clear that this is pretty complex and there's a lot here, and the decisions that you would make at any of these steps could have pretty large impacts for the processes. And there are a few key pieces as we think about the benefits of cover cropping. So in our third GSA example here, at the fourth decision point, they're looking at the consumptive use of precipitation. Now, as we discussed earlier, this includes those decisions around infiltration and runoff in order to get at that consumptive use of precipitation and remove that from the total satellite ET estimate of total total evapotranspiration. In our kind of other examples, as the GSA is adjusting the proportion of precipitation they think will be used by crops, they're making a decision directly related to the processes of precipitation, infiltration, and runoff. So when it comes to incorporating precipitation into GSA processes and especially allocations, there's a ton of variety here. And this is why we didn't include any silver bullet recommendations about how exactly to include cover crops, because there's just so many different approaches that GSAs are taking. That being said, there are clear levers to incorporate the benefits of cover cropping. And these levers all require us to better quantify the factors affecting precipitation, infiltration, and runoff, including cover crop interactions with those processes. So with that, let's move into our opportunities for action. So today we've talked about the steps on the pathway to demand management, to those allocations that help us achieve a sustainable basin. And we've also discussed the factors that are most relevant for cover cropping and where those factors are most important in these processes. Now, an important consideration for our next steps is how we support effective adaptive management. And to do that, we need to think about the context of the GSAs. Much of the work of the GSAs depends on effectively accounting for precipitation, infiltration, and runoff. So what we can offer for cover cropping is potentially helpful much more broadly. Now, GSAs face some daunting challenges around the breadth and complexity of their workloads, around resource limitations, but they also have deep expertise and experience. Generally speaking, though, this expertise is on the engineering side, but not necessarily in other areas that are critical for understanding and managing watershed flows, like soil science or biometeorology, among others. So that being said, there are a lot of opportunities here. GSAs are open to new data and willing to engage, and adaptive management is baked into their DNA, with requirements for them to analyze and revisit their planning. And researchers have a huge role to play in supporting GSAs as they continue to refine these approaches. So GSAs need the right information that can be plugged into existing systems to increase their rigor. Additional support, not scrutiny, will be key here. And I hope it's clear too that the processes around precipitation, infiltration, and runoff are central to GSA management more generally. So refining the representation in these processes will support accounting for cover crop water benefits and beyond. So some of our key next steps. For those processes of infiltration and runoff, we already have a great start with the improvements of often 40% or more. But we also know that if we can more precisely define the impact of cover crops in terms that are relevant for GSAs, we can refine the representation of these processes. And thus, coordinating research is a key step. The next key step, while less intertwined with the policy we've discussed today, there are some other key research needs. And these include articulating the magnitude of difference between winter cover crops and bare ground in satellite-based ET readings specifically. Also, better understanding the conditions that can lead to negligible or even net negative water use for winter cover crops. And finally, capturing the experiences of the many growers who are already doing their own experiments with the practice in water scarce contexts. And we can't wait until this is all tied down. We have information that we can share now to help growers navigate this practice. And therefore, developing guidance is another key next step. Next, we know that there's a ton of variety amongst GSAs, and we know that there are opportunities to incorporate cover crop benefits into their processes. For example, in the conversion from satellite-based ET estimates to the consumptive use of groundwater. So a next big step is to continue working with individual GSAs to implement positive examples of incorporating cover crop benefits. This will also help us better understand what research and in what forms is most useful. We're facing many challenges in California agriculture, and multiple benefit practices are key. Given the benefits of cover cropping, it is especially important. Our work focused on the water quantity impacts of the practice, but it goes beyond that. Cover crops can help with drought and flood resilience, air quality, and drinking water quality, among others. So cover crops and other non-cash crop vegetation are vital management tools in California, which is why we're excited to continue working to support the implementation of SGMA such that non-cash crop vegetation, like cover cropping, remains viable for the health of our ecosystems, agriculture, and people. And that's all I've got for you today. Thank you all for your interest in this important topic. If you haven't checked it out yet, please follow this QR code to see the full report. If there are any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of our team using soils@suscon.org. Thank you so much for tuning in.